Hello, and welcome to another episode of Mormons, Mystics, and Muons, where we focus on reconstruction and recontextualization through an integration of science, psychology, consciousness, and philosophy. I am Gabe.
I'm Eldon.
And Eldon, today we're going to go over an article that I sent you. I actually came across a Psychology Today article about this scientific article. And the Psychology Today article is good, but the study itself is even more fascinating. I want to see the title of the Psychology Today article. It just popped up in my news feed. Was, have you had a drug-free, quote-unquote, psychedelic experience? Research examines what it means to have a spontaneous spiritual awakening. And so the Psychology Today article was posted in January 2023. And when I read this, I was really fascinated because I was like, yes, I have. And I was very interested in approaching it from a academic, more scientific perspective. And so I read the article, thought it was really fascinating. And then the specific scientific article, which we'll put links to both in the show notes. The scientific article is called, it's in the Frontiers in Psychology journal, published in August 19, 2021. And the title is Spontaneous Spiritual Awakenings, Phenomenology, Altered States, Individual Differences, and Well-Being. And it's by Jessica, Sophie Cornell, and David Luke. And I think it's just such a fascinating topic because it's not this idea of awakening, a spiritual awakening, Kundalini awakening, or even like near-death experiences are very similar. They just don't fit into Western psychology. They don't fit into Western religion. And that it causes a lot of problems when people in a Western culture go through these experiences because they're very difficult to make sense of and integrate. And so there's more awareness of it. But I think it's happening more and more often. And so, yeah, I think this article is great. So,
yeah, I was really glad you sent it to me because I think so much of what happens in our world is just putting language around things that we experience, and to see like a scientific approach to some of these ideas. Presumably people have had these kinds of experiences endogenously or exogenously, whether induced by like external methods or just inside of themselves, throughout all time, throughout all places, probably throughout all cultures. I think it's a part of the human experience. Some percentage of the population of us experiencing them, and you get into a place where scientifically you can start to put more definition, put some more words, create some more words, and mix them together to try and define it. And it gets pretty exciting that maybe there's a path of understanding these better. Because, yeah, there's probably been a lot of times where people have had them and not known enough about it or not had a language to address it. And that was what I kept thinking about with all of this, is I'm reading a scientific journal about an experience that's probably common among so many people that have lived in so many places, and yet maybe they didn't have a framework for it. So just interpreting it for themselves is what they were left to. And it'll be exciting, Gabe, as we dig into this together here.
Yeah, I think there's an interesting shift happening because on a few different fronts. One is that, psychedelics are in the zeitgeist because of, well, there was a counterculture, then things got shut down, the war on drugs, but they're back because of mental health and just amazing research that's coming out. And through that research, they kind of stumbling upon the fact that, oh yeah, some of these experiences on psychedelics match these mystical experiences that psychological and like religious research have identified. Like this is a mystical experience that religious people happen and often are at the start of churches, and they're realizing, oh, this is the exact same thing. Then you are also having yoga. Yoga for several decades now has moved to the West. Eastern philosophy in general has been shifting. And Carl Jung talks about this. He has some lectures on Kundalini yoga, but it's really about kind of East and the West meeting. And so people go to yoga because they want the relaxation and the flexibility and whatnot, but they don't realize that actually yoga, the purpose is to cause a spiritual awakening. And so some people do have things happen from without even intending it. And so, yeah, I think it's just becoming more in the consciousness. And then also, we're undergoing some really rapid societal shifts too, in the sense that people are becoming disillusioned with religion, and we've got the internet now. So people having experiences can band together and say like, hey, I have this experience, and create support groups and start to process it that way. There's this shift in the scientific view, especially driven by like quantum physics as well as psychedelic research, where more and more, Lex Friedman, have you listened to Lex Friedman's podcast? I think I've sent you.
Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah. So, Lex Friedman, I haven't listened to too many, but he does research in AI and machine learning. And he just has on, expert after expert, philosopher, computer scientists, AI, physicists, people that are really rethinking our view of science and reality and moving away. There's another generation of scientists that are actually moving away from scientific materialism and are embracing idealism and these very philosophically different frameworks to understand truth. And then AI is here that is shining a huge light in the fact that we don't know, we don't have a consensus on what consciousness is.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of things that I think are shifting. And as we'll go over in this, these experiences happen most in these periods of dramatic trauma or redefining identities. And I think this plays into Mormonism too, and leaving any high demand religion, because this is a period where everything is crashing down on you. And so I think many people leaving Mormonism or Jehovah's Witnesses or whatnot likely have an experience somewhat like this. And also people getting into Mormonism as well. I know when my mom was getting into Mormonism, she said, yeah, I had a lot of these things that you're describing that you're going through as you're leaving Mormonism. So I think it's a very pertinent topic, especially as we redefine certain ways that we look at mental health.
Yeah.
And consciousness.
Yeah, it's exciting. There is seemingly change in every corner of our lives and in every corner of our society and our communities. And I think it is people who are having these internal kind of gnosis kind of experiences where they find something about themselves, about the universe, or about their place in all of it. I think it's those people that help us adjust through the change, kind of navigate the change. I think that it's not like everybody has to have a altered state experience or a spiritual or a spontaneous spiritual awakening. But for those that do, I think there's some maybe a call to action or a change in direction of life that's strong enough that it can have implications, kind of ripple effects for the rest of humanity. And in that way, I think I often look at the fractal of me as an individual compared to the human family and think that, there's some portion of us that's experiencing these awakening kind of these moments, and that's how we get through these times of change, kind of as a family collectively, as one great consciousness. And of course, the spontaneous spiritual awakening, whether Kundalini or otherwise, is often about coming to the realization of that oneness. And so that's where I think idealism, from the scientific standpoint, the scientific approach and the philosophical approach, starts to resonate more for people.
Yeah. This article is great, and we're gonna review it, and some of it's just gonna be reading from it because I couldn't put it better myself. And right before we got on, I was telling you that I was thinking today, I was like, this person either went through a spontaneous spiritual awakening or is very familiar with altered states of consciousness, because this
The
is just
person who wrote
too
it?
good. Yeah. And then,
the
and then I was looking at a YouTube video, and she was talking about her just spontaneous spiritual awakening, where she woke up from a very vivid lucid dream into another state of consciousness where like colors were so much more vivid, and she was just feelings of bliss and nirvana, and like didn't know what was going on, and changed her career, left her job, went into psychology. I was like, I'm going to research this. So we'll start reading this because many people probably don't know what we're talking about with spontaneous spiritual awakening, but it's an actual term, and fairly well defined term. So spiritual awakening is a term given to describe a subjective experience in which an individual's ego transcends their ordinary finite sense of self to encompass a wider, infinite sense of truth or reality. These deeply embodied noetic experiences are often perceived as a direct connection, communion, or non-dual merging within an unlimited and universal consciousness, the divine or God in perceived oneness. Experiences of spiritual awakening, whether gradual or sudden, intentionally induced or spontaneous, typically evoke an ineffable sense of deep inner knowing, understanding, quote unquote, remembering, or quote unquote, unveiling of one's true nature, as well as experiences of peace and equanimity, bliss, ecstasy, and aliveness, feelings of awe, sacredness, gratitude, and reverence, and of abundant, unconditional love. These profound experiences may also trigger a sense of transcendence of time and space, as well as an increase in physical and mental sensitivity to internal and external stimuli, including sensitivity to color, light, touch, sounds, and smells. In some cases, they may be accompanied by strong physical sensations, as appears to be more typical in what we usually refer to as Kundalini awakenings, including but not limited to sensations of heat or energy rising up or shooting up the body, typically in and around the spine, bursts of tingling, tickling, prickling in the body, particularly around the crown of the head, brow point, and heart space, electric sensations in the extremities of body, perceived light emanating from the body, particularly from the heart and head, orgasmic sensations, disruptions in the digestive system, and spontaneous involuntary movements, including trembling or shaking, asanas, yogic postures, and mudras, hand postures. Occasionally, these sensory sensitivities may extend to paranormal-like experiences, with people reporting increased synchronicities, which is Jung's term basically for spiritual experiences, visions of an archetypal or symbolic nature, telepathic experiences, feeling spiritual presences, hearing sounds or voices not produced externally, and seeing things that are not materially present. And I should say that in that whole paragraph, there's just citation after citation. They're basically summarizing all the other research on this phenomenon and how it's described in other people's research.
Yeah, there was a lot in there, and I've got a number of comments, things that we can kind of dive into. I think one of the first that comes up in the paragraph you read is a mention of non-dual merging. non-dual is, of course, about non-duality, which maybe some people are not as familiar with, or there's a lot to, I think, take in about that idea alone. But I asked ChatGPT to kind of summarize it. Non-duality, also known as non-dualism, is a philosophical and spiritual concept that suggests the absence of a fundamental separation or duality between different aspects of existence. And I think, it's often associated with religious or philosophical traditions, Vedanta, Zen Buddhism, Taoism, certain mystical interpretations of Christianity. And there's, a lot of YouTube videos or otherwise that you can find about non-duality or non-dualism. It's simply that melting away of the idea that there's a division between things. I think in these spiritual awakenings sometimes lead to that, because what has been created in the ego, at least from when we're born, where we are starting out as kind of this blank slate, we start to divide things. That's how we can negotiate and navigate the world, is ascribing meaning to individual objects and things, making that map of meaning for ourselves to navigate. And there can be a way to, I think, take a step back and recognize that those are all symbols and that those are all divisions made by ourselves so that we can function in the world. And I don't know that it's realistic to walk around as in that complete non-duality every moment of every day, because ultimately I don't think you could get much done there. But having the kind of the glimpse of it, at least speaking from my own experience, having that glimpse of that non-dual nature of reality can be very, very profound.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, essentially these experiences are waking up, like achieving lucidity in a dream, akin to achieving lucidity in a dream, realizing you're in the matrix. These are all allegories for this expanded awareness and just paradigm shift. And so I'll share my experience at this point. So I went through what meets, what they'll classify as a spontaneous Kundalini awakening. And Kundalini is a Hindu term. So this is a Hindu term, Kundalini awakening. And it's just this raising of awareness, this idea of the divine feminine, Shakti, which is supposedly at the base of the spine, coming up, a serpent uncoiling and reaching Shiva, which is, the divine masculine in your head. And this is just
a model.
Yeah, it's just how the Hindus call it. Jung, I think his concept of individuation. And I think in the Christianity too, these being born again, Pentecostal type things. This happens. There are words and models and ways of describing this in many different cultures. But I didn't know any of this stuff. I didn't know, I didn't even know what Buddhism was, Hinduism. So about a year and a half ago, my life just drastically shifted. Just recently separated and was coming off full-time RVing, had a separation and moving, before full-time RVing, I was working in public health as a dentist in upstate New York, and then took a bit of a sabbatical with the birth of my second son, and then ended up coming to Oregon. And so everything had essentially crumbled down for me, in terms of career wise. I had a lot of anxiety switching from public health to private practice, dentistry. And also it's like the going back to work on a Monday after the weekend, but I had been off for half a year, at this point. And so that was in flux, and this whole new future that I didn't know what was going to happen with this divorce. And then on top of it, I had left Mormonism about 6 years prior and just kind of floated around in agnosticism, figured like I wasn't going to figure out anything. If we had already figured things out as a society, we'd have some consensus on it. And so everything that I basically identified myself as was gone. And in this process, I think divorces particularly are the impetus for many people having profound shifts in their awareness, spirituality, whatnot. And because it caused you to look inward of like, what happened, I went from just thinking communication issues to like going down the rabbit hole of psychology and mental health and learning about attachment science and like how we develop from a baby creates these sunglasses that we wear our whole life, and we just view reality differently. And just an intense time of like a lot of pain and stress and anxiety. And everything I'd done up to that point was not working. So I was like, okay, I'm going to try something different. And I went down that rabbit hole, started listening to this podcast, and just dove deep into neuroscience and mental health and attachment, and listen to podcasts about psychedelics and mental health, and learned about nonviolent communication. And nonviolent communication is just this just whole different paradigm of the fact that we as society have developed language that is built around moral judgments, good, bad, right, wrong. And that if we actually move away from that and realize that we're all humans with the same needs of love, safety, security, respect, autonomy, and just reframe that. Everybody's just trying to meet their needs, but some in a very, very less effective way and some in a more effective way. And that was just a huge paradigm shift. And they just got me thinking about different things. I was getting into lucid dreaming because I was like, trying to figure out the meaning of life. And I also was like, I guess I'm just going to totally give up on God. I didn't really believe in God, and started, I'm going to follow Sam Harris, who Wikipedia told me was a atheist. So I was like, I guess I'm done with any sort of spirituality or God or anything. And I'd never meditated really before, and started doing meditation. I started doing some breath work. But there was one night where we'll talk about all these different things in this article, but I was on the bed and I just started having these contractions of my arms, legs. I think they call them Kriyas, basically. I think that's a yogic term. But these, it felt like a release. It felt good. It felt like a release of trauma, energy, letting go of things, like a cleansing. I remember like I didn't know what was going on. I was like, I'm not doing this. I didn't fight it. And then I remember that like a day or two later, I was trying to like redo it and I couldn't. It was just a process that happened itself. And it's very common with these Kundalini awakenings. And looking back, I'm like, I think I may have done my first like breathwork session from YouTube somewhat previous, a week or so prior to that. So that could have kind of triggered this. And then after that, I started having this kind of just like energy or feeling of I would feel in my legs, and it felt good. It felt like being alive. It felt kind of like I used to have this burst of like joy, excitement, or whatever, like right before a vacation or something, or like, oh, I don't have to worry about work. I'm going to just, life is good. And it'd just be this little glimmer. And then eventually you'd come back down. It wouldn't be that long lived, but it was like that experience that I was having just 1% of the time previously was like expanding to 5%, 10%, 30, 40, 50. Like it just was becoming more of this new feeling. But I would have this feeling, this energy or vibration or buzzing or whatever, good feeling that would start my legs. And then as I really felt, I guess that sort of like the Holy Spirit in overdrive. And the more I was thinking about these things and piecing together and understanding my life and philosophizing about things, it would raise along my spine. And I didn't know what was going on, but I was talking to a friend about it who had spent some time in Sedona and who studied some energy work. He's a computer programmer, but he had a little stint where he did some polarity work, which is this not like Reiki, but somewhat similar. And I was explaining this to him, and I was also just talking like philosophically about him, like the nature of time and reality, and like does the past and the future exist? And I remember one time he's like, "These are really psychedelic thoughts," because he had also been to Burning Man and stuff. I had never done anything. He's like, "These are really psychedelic thoughts, and you're not on psychedelics." But I told him about this feeling, and he's like, "Yeah, I think you should look up Kundalini Awakening." I never remembered hearing the term before, and I Googled it. I was like, "Oh yeah, this meets this." What people are saying online. I didn't look into it too much. But then I started having some really blissful states of just feeling unconditional love and connection with people. I remember I started some therapy, and after this one session, which I really just opened up to this therapist, and I remember after the session, I just felt so like blissful in a way I'd never felt before. And I was like, did not know what it was. And it was also very vulnerable because it's like, this is amazing. And like, also what if like I lose this therapist or something? I did not know what was happening. It was big shifts that I was going through. I've been introduced to the role in mental health that psychedelics were playing in the research and stuff, and then talked to my friend a bit about his experience with different ones. I wasn't doing anything, but I had learned about like MDMA and its role in PTSD and the trials that they were having. And it was interesting because like there were some experiences like, I think this is probably this really matches what that they're describing in that podcast of how this makes you feel. And I just also read How to Change Your Mind by Michael Pollan, where he was talking about the fact that these psychedelics, they bind to our serotonin receptors, and our bodies can likely produce these things endogenously by itself. And that there's some evolutionary or whatever you want to assign to it significance of that. And the fact, he talks about in that book that you put people doing psilocybin and experienced meditators in an MRI, and they're having the same brain waves happening. And so, a lot of support for the idea that these are states of consciousness, destinations, and just whether it's a spontaneous awakening, Kundalini awakening, psychedelics, breath work, fasting, whatever, these are all just modes of transportation to these states of consciousness. And then I started experiencing a lot of like synchronicities, things that like spiritual experiences, but I wasn't into religion at all, things that were just so coincidental. And I didn't really know what was going on because I was never the person in church that would have, was getting up testimonies. I never really had many significant experiences like that at all. I was very skeptical. I would always dismiss people's stories about garments and whatnot, but all of a sudden these really, really bizarre things that just were lining up were happening. And I, sure enough, ended up talking to somebody as I was exploring this. And it's like, oh yeah, those are called, synchronicities, as Carl Jung talked about this. So I was just learning as I was going, listening to a lot of Alan Watts, and like thinking about these things would really get this feeling, going up and down my spine, like going upwards. And then I started learning about Hinduism, this idea that we're all connected. We're all like God dreaming, discovering that these are all other parts of herself. And we're all one. And it just opened me up to this like intense love for even these strangers that I was meeting. It's like, oh, this is another part of me. And I had a couple of experiences that kind of the most incredible experiences that they'll talk about in this article, where I was just thinking about this idea and talking to somebody, and all of a sudden, like, reality was just becoming so much more vibrant and beautiful. Like, visually, colors were so much deeper than I had ever experienced before. And this feeling of like intense love, and the person became really beautiful, and not in like a romantic but just like so beautiful, like the most masterful high definition photo. And there's just this clarity about it. And I like had never experienced this ever before. And it's like a different dimension of experiencing things. And it wasn't in like meditation with my eyes closed, and it wasn't with, I had taken any plant medicine or whatnot. It was just talking to somebody at work and just connecting with this idea that like, oh, we are one. And like, it was just like a different layer of reality. I didn't see anything that wasn't there. Just everything became so beautiful. And it probably happened two different times to that level. So it's kind of in and out of these like really just peak experiences. And in those moments, I was like, I do not know, like I've never experienced this before, and I don't know, have no context. I had not talked to anybody who had experienced this. And eventually, I remember when I first talked to somebody that had gone through a similar process. One of the synchronicities that happened was I finally found a place, came to Oregon, finally found a place to move to. And I remember just drawing these connections between like Buddhism, Mormonism, and searched like Mormon Buddhism. I was like, anybody else make these connections? And found Lower Lights Wisdom, led by Thomas McConkie, and found that they had a lodge that they used for their retreats 10 minutes from where I was moving, and that there were some people in the community there that were involved. And I remember scrolling the website, and like it was like welcome home, and it was just so bizarre that I moved so close to this. I did end up going on a retreat there. And then shortly after, got in contact with somebody part of that group, and she was like, yep, I've gone through all those things. And she was working on her counseling degree. It's like very well-grounded person. She had gone through this a few years earlier. And for her, she was seeing different doctors, and they were trying to figure out what was going on, whether hormone imbalance or whatnot, but just because it's not in the awareness of Western medicine and psychology. And so it just felt so relieving to hear somebody saying like, yeah, this is what's happening. This is what it is. And all along the way, there were these people that just kind of helped ground me and just kind of explain, yeah, this is what's happening. These are the resources to look at and integrate it. And without those, like, I really would be lost. I don't experience those things now, fortunately and unfortunately, because it is really hard to like stay just doing the normal day-to-day things when this whole new world is open to you. But it was such a beautiful and bizarre experience with some really challenging times, because when you swing high, you also have these really, you're shifting a lot of things. It's like going down a ski slope where you've been in a rut your whole life and you're trying to get out of it. And so like you make a hard bank left and you get onto this new track that you're doing, and then you fall right back into it. It can be pretty jarring. And so yeah, that's my
Yeah.
experience. And when I read this, it was really beautiful to read this article that just so scientifically talked about it. And so I got transported, kind of thrust into this new state of consciousness. And then my integration, this went on over like 6-9 months, with these different experiences throughout it. But then I had to it's kind of like when you're doing a maze, you do the maze backwards, and it's a little bit easier. But I got there, and then I was like, okay, how does this fit in with science and logic and rationality and philosophy? And that's been like the whole year since, of just like playing catch up and learning this philosophy and science and mental health and this type of stuff.
Integrating.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that, Gabe. When you talk about that story, it's a beautiful thing, and I'm sure it is ineffable, but you're probably putting the words that you can around it to describe it. I would say that these spiritual awakenings are probably, I want to think of them as valid for everybody that has them and just tries to describe them, and that there's no one way that they happen, and they're probably as unique as the individuals they're happening to. And I think there's always a filter. Ultimately, our brain is kind of it's best at probably reducing. It's more of a filter than anything, you could say. Maybe you could say that the brain is just it's mastered just reducing information down to things that matter and putting them into places for us to be able to navigate the world. And so when you have an experience that goes kind of outside of that filter, I think that encompasses broader reality or broader truth, it can be probably scary. It can be exhilarating. Some of these feelings that it says, or some of these outcomes, whether gradual or sudden, intentionally induced or spontaneous, they typically evoke an ineffable sense of deep inner knowing, understanding, remembering, or unveiling, which is an interesting reference as like an unveiling in Mormonism, the idea of the veil of forgetfulness that's brought into your mind as you leave the premortal world and come into the mortal world. And I often heard it growing up in the church that when you learn something by revelation, you really just, it's being revealed, as in it's being uncovered to you, or you're remembering it. That's kind of the analog here, is that it's being pulled back. It's almost like it's the filter that's being turned off more than anything, maybe. Experiences of peace, equanimity, bliss, ecstasy, and aliveness, feelings of awe, sacredness, gratitude, and reverence, abundant, unconditional love. When I thought of the unconditional love, I feel like there's room to see the story of Jesus Christ as someone who was in their midlife, at least that kind of age range of 30s, who had an experience like this. I still like to think of this story of Jesus in the desert and the kind of bringing it together, unifying the opposites inside of himself, and then having an experience that maybe was spontaneous spiritual awakening, and then being able to just kind of articulate that. And people were amazed at his ability to articulate that. I think it's clear that in John 17, he's talking about the oneness. And so that was some of the things that grated against the institutions and the religion leaders of the day. The profound experiences trigger a sense of transcendence of time and space. Of course, time and space are constructs. And I think of sleep as a good example of, sleep is time travel, basically. Time goes faster when you're asleep, right? But to other people outside watching you, time's not going any faster. So is it just from your reference point that it's going faster? Ultimately, the state that's the baseline of being awake. We can also go under certain medications before surgery that put us to sleep and change how we perceive time. So I think time and space can be altered really heavily in these different states. I have two questions for you, Gabe, as you talk about your story. During this time, I mean, and, you know, to the extent that you're comfortable here, I know it's a sensitive and ongoing thing, but you were experiencing this separation from your wife. So was there also feelings of like painful, was there also hard things you're going through at the same time as this, or had you done a lot of that prior?
I feel like, no, I mean, there were dips into that throughout this, but I actually, I know I couldn't have gone through that experience without this. And I think that is, yeah, I mean, I feel
Yeah.
like this was basically the universe taking over, trying not to get too woo woo here, but just like, okay, like you've tried. Um, I want to strip everything down because you didn't, yeah, you didn't quite get it right. And we're going to blank slate. And in that collapse of everything, that burning down of the forest, like this is where you um, reach the growth,
Yeah.
have the new growth.
Yeah. And I bring that up because with my own experience, which we can probably maybe get into on another episode, because I think if we keep it focused to this article and kind of what you've shared here, it's substantive. But the painful times, it's almost like I recognized at one point what I described before I had a real good way to or a term for it, what I described as like this elastic nature of the universe, where when things get really bad on one end, they actually get really good on another
Yep,
end.
for sure.
And when I came across the Kabbalion and the principle of correspondence, it's when it lined up for me, as above, so below, as within, so without. It was this kind of as deep of a sorrow as the heart can go through. It's almost like a carving out process of the heart, if we're using symbology here. And the deeper that the carving goes, the more that the joy or the blissful state or these kind of awakening moments can fill up. Like the deeper the heart is carved by sorrow, the more joy can be filled up inside of it. And that, I think, kind of there, because it mentions in this article that oftentimes they are triggered, or at least happening around the time of very traumatic or sorrowful or very difficult life-changing events, as you've already kind of mentioned. My other question, as you're talking about synchronicities, and there's a lot of ways to describe synchronicities, everything from maybe deja vu at some level falls into a synchronicity, where it's almost like I've had deja vu where I feel like it lasted about a minute long, and that I could tell what was going to happen next in the next moment before it happened, but I didn't have enough time to put it into words. But as it was happening, it was unfolding in the way that I was seeing it unhappen. A couple of times in my life, these really, really intense deja vu moments of almost like, this, I know exactly what's going to happen next. And it's never anything beyond just my local, like, it's not like on a global scale or on anything, I can't tell Powerball numbers, but like people that I'm having conversations with, and then someone comes up and says something, and I could almost, if I could freeze time, I'd be able to spell out what could happen. And having moments like that, it's I think there's a lot of other ways that it kind of manifests as a synchronicity, let's say, things that can't be explained, that we have the idea that the world is cause and effect, or the universe is cause and effect, but synchronicities seem to fall outside of that. It's almost like not a direct cause, not a direct effect, but information's being kind of read off of some other plane almost. And so did it feel like, as you're having these synchronicities, did it feel like it was kind of happening at a line upon line basis? Like you weren't getting to the very top of the stack of information before you had the bottom. Does that make sense what I'm saying? Did it feel like it built upon itself
Yeah.
from where you started recognizing?
Yeah. And everything was just, I mean, it was like curated where one person would tell me just like, oh, you should read How to Change Your Mind by Michael Pollan because they were going on their own journey. And then another person would give me this other, like looking back, because there's a lot of books written on all of this stuff. And a lot of them have a lot of stuff that's, I think, wrong or not consistent with philosophy and science, neuroscience, and consciousness. But somehow amongst them all, like I had the right people at the right time introducing the exact next thing that I needed to learn. And then the really bizarre thing would be I would like just slowly like crystallize this new understanding. And it really was like I felt like my consciousness was shifting into a gear that I had never been in before. And this was one really fascinating thing with this feeling of this energy going up and down. This really felt like an elevated state of consciousness. It was very, very fickle and volatile. And I would get in this and it'd be from like listening to Alan Watts or just like making all these connections about my life and my upbringing and why things were the way they were. And then shame, guilt, fear, any of that would enter in, boom, shut down. Like even I could have just like crystallized some thought and then felt like, oh, what does this person think of me? Like maybe I was too vulnerable, because a lot of this was, I opened up a lot of this by just being vulnerable and going against things that had always limited me. And so it was very fascinating that as soon as like I would have this fear of like, oh, what does this person think of me? They must think I'm like this crazy person. And like that feeling would instantly be gone and be very uncomfortable. And then I would learn like, okay, I'm just going to be vulnerable and lean into this and kind of call it out and like message persons like, hey, like I'm worried, like I hope that like wasn't too vulnerable for you. And as soon as I lean into that, I would often just have, a really positive response from the person and it would be back. And so it was like being taught of in real time feedback of like, again, think about this as like the spirit. But you like in real time, you can train yourself of like what this is like biofeedback, neurofeedback idea of being able to be aware of your heart rate or your brain, more favorable brain patterns so that your body can learn to optimize those. But yeah, I would kind of crystallize this new way of conceptualize something. And then right when I like pretty much figured out, I would read somebody's article that exactly described what I was just as though I had just written it. And so that would happen. I was reading the Celestine Prophecy at the time, which is very good, like fictional allegory about basically these steps of awakening. And it was so weird because I would kind of put it down and read it, take breaks from it. Every time that I picked it up and read it, it was like teaching me the exact thing that was going on in my life. I'm like, okay, this is how this will happen and whatnot. So it's really, really bizarre, but cool.
Yeah. Yeah. And in, I think in Mormonism, the reference of line upon line, precept upon precept comes to mind. And in that way, I feel like for me, it's been very healthy and I think healing and empowering to reframe my 35 years plus, approximately 35 years of Mormonism, and then now not Mormonism, that kind of gateway to another place beyond, as a line upon line, as part of that precept upon precept. Like that's an idea that your brain can only make the connections that it's kind of primed and ready to make based on what you're worldview is and what almost like what I was exposing, the ideas that I was exposing myself to. And so within Mormonism, I felt like so much of it worked for me for so long because it really was expanding the edges of my consciousness. It was
Mm-hmm.
causing the brain and the heart to spin together in one kind of unison. And that wasn't until breaking beyond that barrier that I saw a dramatic increase in those types of synchronicity experiences. If we call synchronicity the same as feeling the spirit, let's say, just to use the language, I felt the spirit in so many new ways, exciting ways, and thrilling ways, stepping out of all of that, and kind of the line upon line concept. Just like you said, picking up a book, reading a couple paragraphs of it, and then 3 weeks later being exposed to different ideas or something that when I go back and revisit the book and pick up where I left off, then it was giving me something new that I was almost primed
Mm-hmm.
for. It was like I
Yeah.
wasn't ready to read on until these 3 weeks passed and other ideas came in. That was, I think it characterized for me the whole experience in some ways.
Mm-hmm. All right, let's keep on going here. So, experiences referred to as Kundalini Awakenings were first highlighted in the Tantric and Yoga scriptures of 5th and 6th centuries AD, namely the Yoga Vasishta and the Yoga Kundalini Upanishad and the Hagayotha Pradipika. These experiences were considered powerful catalysts to awaken latent potential through the unification of the polarities of the mind, perceived duality, into oneness, perceived non-duality. As seen through the lens of these traditions, the lineages that have followed, Kundalini energy lies dormant, coiled at the base of the spine until it is moved or awakened. As it uncoils, the energy makes its way up the central nadi, or subtle energy channels, adjacent to the spine, namely the Ida, left channel, and the Pingala, or the right channel, through the Shushumna, central channel, piercing each chakra or energy point as it reaches the Sasrara, the crown of the head. The settling of this energy at the crown of the head is said to provoke experiences of spiritual ecstasy or enlightenment. Whilst both terms are interchangeable and clearly overlap, Kundalini awakenings are typically associated with greater physical and energetic symptoms than general spiritual awakenings. I think what's interesting about this is like, I mean, as a Mormon, as a Christian, whatever, like you don't explore these things at all, but like these things have been around forever, and like things that are made up don't stick around forever. Like these things
Evolution.
happen, and there's such a in-depth, overwhelming culture and science and myth, and so I mean, it's kind of dizzying how deep you can go in all these energy points and chakras and whatnot. And then, yeah, in terms of the Kundalini versus the spiritual awakenings, I think that, yeah, this is all in a gradient. And so I think a lot of people, when they're leaving Mormonism, they have this kind of, manic energy that like they stay up all night reading these things and just deconstructing. That was another thing that when at the height of these experiences for me, I was, some days I would only be sleeping 2 or 3 hours. And this wasn't like I had no bags under my eyes, felt completely energized, and was just fine on that little. And we'll talk later, I mean, there is some overlap in this. This can happen badly and be related somewhat to bipolar manic episodes. But this was different. This is, they differentiate that spiritual awakenings and Kundalini awakenings are profoundly positive and relieving of anxiety and depression, as opposed to psychopathology. So yeah, that was bizarre too. I was like, I got 2 hours of sleep and I feel fine and I'm energized and no bags under my eyes. And I wish, and a lot of people that I talk to like have that experience. It's like, oh yeah, I did not have to sleep much.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the article here's taking a little bit to kind of differentiate the spiritual or the kind of spontaneous spiritual, it calls spiritual awakening, versus the Kundalini. And I appreciate what you say. It's on a gradient, meaning that like it's not just binary, as it's either Kundalini or it's not just spontaneous, or it's not. It's kind of all spiritual. It's kind of all spontaneous in some ways. And the Kundalini aspect of it ties back to these ancient ways of a language that describes it, chakra, the energy channels, energy points throughout the body, which have been kind of part of Eastern philosophy for a long time. This snake coiled from the base of the spine that makes its way up. I think images of snake in mythology are older than almost any other, including the Garden of Eden and the base of a tree and a snake there, and kind of other mythologies in the world where there's a world tree with a snake that lies slumbering at the base of it, waiting to be nudged awake, and then it goes up and makes things change. And again, these are all languages and models to describe this thing, and it is very much a individual experience. But it's amazing how very little sleep you were able to run on while you were having this. It's like an energy that's just kind of burning.
Yeah, one thing I found with that too is during this period when I didn't need much sleep, I was kind of riding on this really profound insight and just energy. But then when I started to dip down into ruminating or worrying about stuff, I would just get so tired. And then if I did something that would get me back up into whether sometimes singing, I did a lot of singing that helped kind of, creative works, I think are linked to this energy channeling, whatever. I think that the Kundalini versus spiritual awakening, I've met two people that have gone through what they would consider Kundalini awakenings. I met a bunch of people who went through a spiritual awakening, and the spiritual awakening, some people it's goes on for years. It's oh yeah, at this point I got introduced to this and I started meditating here, started doing yoga here, and they have some of these peak experiences, but not to the degree as I think a Kundalini awakening, and they don't have the contractions. I view this as you're on a 4-lane highway and you're in the fast lane, and a Kundalini awakening is when you realize that in 200 feet you've got an exit that you have to make, and so you're just jerking it to the right, and it's very abrupt and chaotic. And spiritual awakening is you're in the fast lane and you realize maybe a mile down the road you have to take an exit, and so you're able to, you still feel that movement and you still have things shifting and you got to get over, but it's more metered out. So there's a lot of this. It's a function of how unaligned you are, how much you are unraveling, and how much trauma you're working through, and how quickly you have to do it, how quickly it's happening.
Maybe there's a sense of the awareness to it. It requires your attention, your conscious attention at some point. And maybe if it's not just going to happen spontaneously through just what would be the less abrupt, maybe slower moving, then it eventually works its way into the more physiological routes of, I think of my own experience probably had a lot to do with some physiological things going on. And it's there's something inside there knocking, the imagery of the Christ on the other side of the door knocking. Let's say it's the self that you're idealized and that you are kind of, you have the opportunity to open the door, and maybe when you don't, eventually it kicks down the door, comes in. Yeah. It's wake up.
Yeah. And that's, and it's interesting hearing your story and other people's story. Because for some people it's a divorce. Other people, it's like the body just is like, I am not doing this anymore. I mean, you've got a GPS system that's like telling you, okay, you need to take an exit in 2 miles. Okay, you need to take an exit in 1 mile. And then it's like, it also has power to take over your car, or make it very uncomfortable if you don't get over into that exit. And so your story of your autoimmune stuff, and then another friend of mine who had autoimmune stuff, and then I think lupus that she also cured as she finally, accepted and both her sexuality and her became an astrologer. This stuff that she had just kind of pushed away, had this occult interests in her. And then another friend who, it was adrenal insufficiency for her. So for some people it's autoimmune. I didn't have any of that, although oddly enough, I cured my thinning hair through this. But there's definitely like a psychosomatic aspect. And I saw a Jung post on the Jung subreddit, because Reddit knows that I've looked at some Jung stuff. And somebody was saying like, there's some interesting posts there, because people are like, I'm seeing ghosts, or I'm seeing these things in like what's happening. And I liked somebody's comment. Somebody was having some really bizarre things happening in their life. And somebody said, well, this is your subconscious, and it tries to work in the methods that, it does dreams, does other things, but like eventually if you don't listen to it, it's like, I'm going to ratchet up, I'm going to go into your waking life, and things will happen so that like you need to listen to this. So it's, there's a, when I was looking through learning about Kundalini Awakening stuff, there was a movie project that kind of got stalled with COVID, and it's turned into, they've got some YouTube videos in a community, but it's called When Lightning Strikes. And it's a lady, normal, professional, Western, maybe she did some yoga, I'm not sure, but she had a Kundalini awakening that just like rocked her world and was so disorienting. And she did not know what was happening to her until she finally found a therapist who had an awareness of this and was able to help her integrate. And then she's like, people don't know about this. And she started like doing this project. And so there's some good content from them that I looked at, and they call it When Lightning Strikes, because a lot of people, that's the terminology they have, is that it's like energy lighting, and it's all the same stuff: synchronicities, weird stuff, precognition, psychic phenomenon. And this all also happens with near-death experiences. I read Eben Alexander's book, who's a neurosurgeon who was not into any of this stuff, had a coma. Basically his brain shut down. He had this bizarre experience. And one of the things with his near-death experience, and a lot of near-death experiences, and these experiences, his Kundalini Awakenings, that the psychedelic or the altered states of consciousness, they are described as, these mystical states are described as realer than real life. Like your real life seems like a dream when you're experiencing these things. And it really did when I was in the, at these peak experiences, like all my life before I started thinking about these, it seemed so hazy and murky, as though it was a dream that I just woke up from. Now it's gone back to a normal, like I'm more on that normal plane of reality, but I'm in a different spot. But same thing with near-death experience. Like this is realer than real. And I think that's important when, especially in terms of Mormonism and this talk of spiritual eyes, and Martin Harris, said that he just saw the plates of the spiritual eyes, and these things are just like guided meditations. There's a whole broad spectrum of these experiences, and yes, some of them are like guided meditations. So there's like a path life regression, and they see something and they make some sense out of it. But this is a whole broad map of states of consciousness, and there are other experiences that are, you are awake, you're not meditating. It is a psychedelic experience without any substances. Um, and that's
Yeah.
what these things fall under.
Yeah. And you mentioned Carl Jung, which I think a lot of his approach has brought me a lot of healing and a lot of ways to view this stuff. But he talked about the unconscious, the shadow, the part of us that we suppress, and the unconscious being, or the shadow being kind of an element of ourselves. And I think in these awakening moments, we can actually get a glimpse of what that is in us. Although Carl Jung, I believe, said that that the unconscious can never be fully mapped. Like, it's broader and deeper and bigger than we could ever really fully approach and map. At least he thought so at the time. Then there's, Jonathan Haidt also has a way of describing it like the elephant and the rider, that we're just riding atop this elephant. Our conscious mind, that filter, that reducing mechanism of the brain, which puts all of what we're seeing in reality into enough kind of packets to where we can navigate it all, is just a rider on top of an elephant. How much does let's say a human rider have? How much control does a human rider have ultimately? If the elephant wants to go one way, it's going to go, and that unconscious can shake that rider up at times. We're going this direction. We're trampling over this stuff. And, it's sometimes we're just along for the ride, I think. And then maybe once we get past it, when we look back at the kind of the damage that it did, or the construction, whatever way we want to look at it, it can be inspiring. It can be beautiful.
Mm-hmm. All right, we'll read some more traditional texts from the Tantra and Yoga lineages, such as the Paratrishta Vivarana and Yoga Kundalini Upanishad, discuss the attainment of spiritual and Kundalini awakenings through asana, or yogic movements, mudra, or hand postures, pranayama, breathwork and breath retention, bandhas, body locks, and the manipulation of the ohas, libido energy, through the act of brahmacharya, celibacy, or chastity. While recent studies confirm the power of spiritual contemplative practices such as yoga, meditation, and mindfulness as catalysts for gradual and sudden states of awakening, these may also occur during sex, near-death experiences, contact with nature, as a result of homeostatic imbalance like fasting, sleep deprivation, or intense athletic activity, and through the use of mind-altering substances, particularly of classic psychedelics such as psilocybin, LSD, and DMT. Although they appear to most frequently emerge following periods of prolonged psychological turmoil or trauma, including loss, bereavement, and addiction. However, whilst specific conditions, factors, and/or triggers may preempt these experiences, these may also occur void of any apparent trigger, though this appears to be less frequent. Awakening experiences do not appear, therefore, to be mediated by the subject's spiritual or religious context, as is further illustrated by the responses of 1,509 American participants to a Gallup survey from 2002, to which a staggering 41%, projecting to 80 million American adults, fully identified with the statement, quote, "I have had a profound religious experience or awakening that changed the direction of my life," end quote. 25% of whom reported having no religious preference. This response may also suggest that profound mystical experiences such as spiritual and Kundalini awakenings might occur more frequently within the general population than generally considered. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think we talked about this earlier or even before we started recording, but I couldn't just stop thinking about how many times in how many places people would have experienced something like this. And we're really, I think, fortunate to have like yogic texts and ideas that put language around it, or at least some way of dealing with it, productively. I couldn't imagine what it would be like to not have the internet to Google search, a couple hundred or 1,000 or more years ago, living in some smaller community that's isolated and having something like this happen, and then not having a way to kind of put it into context. and maybe it always just is beyond language anyway. I think these are all good models. The Vedic teachings, the Upanishads, this is like predating Christianity by hundreds of years or thousands of years, and I think it goes beyond all of that.
Hmm. Yeah, having somebody. I mean, I can't I can't overstate how bizarre and different and just something you had never experienced. You know, I'd been alive for 37 years, never experienced anything like this. And what's difficult when it's an endogenous experience is you can't blame it on anything you took or drank or anything. It's like, and this is part of the difficulty with this is people are like, either I'm crazy or I'm God or Jesus. And they don't want to be crazy. And so there's a difficult aspect of this in that these are often precipitated by trauma, people who've gone through significant trauma in their life. And that creates this, potential energy. And I think leaving Mormonism, again, your whole everything is collapsing. It creates a lot of potential energy, particularly this trauma. It creates this potential, but it also is such a knife edge because if the person isn't supported and if there's nobody around to help them navigate it, it is a psychedelic experience. If there's nobody there to guide them and facilitate it, they are, likely very at risk of having a very bad experience and having it turn into psychopathology. There's a quote: "The psychotic drowns in the same waters in which the mystic swims with the light." So there's a lot of overlap in these experiences, and yeah, it's a recipe for profound change. Most of the people that I know that are most aware and healed and unconditionally loving are people that came from very difficult upbringings and or marriages, experiences, and there are many people that have come from those difficult experiences and are going more in the darkness and really struggling with them.
Yeah, I think in like the analogs in nature around like earthquakes or islands forming, magma coming up through the ocean and just becoming new islands, new places to ground and stand on, even, or like even bigger, maybe the poles shifting, the North and South Pole, and the reversal of those over time. Long enough periods of time, and they can switch. It's like that. It's like it's a turning over, looking at the other side of the coin. There's the Greek god Janus, the one who keeps watch at the doors, or the god of change, I think, where he's a two-faced, one facing in each direction, the forward and the backward, but both looking. And it's that time.
Yeah, and they were talking here about the religious context and how most of these don't, occur, or a lot of these occur with people that are not religious, spiritual. Interesting enough, the author of this article, she was saying she was raised atheist or agnostic, so it's not like, it's not like she was looking for this. And for me, I was so profoundly grateful that I didn't believe in anything at this time. I mean, I was like, all right, Sam Harris. I remember thinking, like, I guess I'm letting go, believing in, in God. And I still struggle with the word God, and it was because I didn't hold to anything that I had such a raw, beautiful experience. I think that other people who haven't got to that level and are maybe more predisposed to this, because certain people, as we'll see, are more likely to have these experiences just due to their like traits of absorption or their temporal lobe ability.
Porosity. Yeah.
Yeah,
The temporal lobe.
this is the second comforter. This is Denver Snuffer's experiences. These are, the way, if you're Christian, you're going to see Jesus and God.
Yeah.
If you're a Catholic, you're going to see Mother Mary. If you're, if you're holding on to something, you're pretty satisfied in that. Your brain, and this is how we construct reality. We take in input and we say, okay, let's match this to something in the past that we've experienced. And your brain, I was just listening to a talk between Sam Harris and somebody who was talking about Bayesian inferences, and just how our brain works is that actually we're just receiving sensory input and we're just trying to get enough of it to heuristically say, okay, does this match a tree? And like, how likely are we to have seen trees before? And if it's a good match, okay, like let's put a tree up there on the screen. Oh wait, no, this is not matching a tree. So let's, switch to something else. And that's what's happening in these experiences, I think, not just in these religious, spiritual, but UFOs, Sasquatch, whatever, because these are all, they have these weird synchronicities and telepathy and feelings of bliss and whatnot, is that something is happening, that your conscious experience is getting input that it has never before seen. And It's like, all right, throw something up there quick because we don't know how to categorize this.
Well, and I think we see through this filter, we see reality through a filter. In the New Testament, we see through a glass darkly, as it were. And I don't know that it's much of a speculation to say that if Joseph Smith was having experiences like this, whether in his youth or his late teenage years or even as an adult, and that he was applying the filter that he had at the time. He was, I think, certainly integrating from a lot of different places. And if he had something like this happen, there was the trauma of his early years, as we've mentioned in previous episodes, perhaps as a component of it. But yeah, I think you do. And I also think there's the yoga, the Kundalini, all of that is the language of Eastern philosophy. I don't think you have to adopt all of this as absolute truth. These are just people that had been able to experience it at a time that predates science, that built a language for it. So it's really helpful even today, I think, to use some of the language. And if Joseph Smith was having spontaneous spiritual awakenings, or had at least one that was profound, that caused him to devote his life to something, then maybe it was just through that Christian filter, and it feels like it's revelatory, or at least it's downloading some new information. So he was just building on top of what he was already standing on from his youth, something like that. It's one way to see it.
Yeah. And he had the leg surgeries without any anesthetic. And I think those would be very likely to cause a dissociative or a fracture in the psyche that I think play into whether it's first vision or, those type of experiences, and or his ability to channel, produce the Book of Mormon, just like many other automatic writing pieces as well. And this also, this is really what I think of when I hear him say, no man knows my history. Like, if I wouldn't have experienced myself, I wouldn't believe it. I very much relate to that. And I feel bad for him because he didn't have the internet, and he did a lot of trauma in his life. So you experience these things, he grew up in poverty. He had those traumas. And then just the act of experiencing something, whether it's through this method or through entheogen, psychedelics, whatever, experiencing something that is realer than real. And then people not believing you too. It adds to that trauma. And I think it exists. I think it explains the persecution complex of the Joseph Smith and the church even today. It creates that kind of egoic structure. You don't have somebody, you don't have the internet to read up on, you don't have
Yeah.
support groups, you don't have somebody else. And once you claim that you're the prophet, it's not that you can say like, hey, Brigham, I was just had this crazy thing happen last night. I don't know what it means. Because you're the prophet, you should be able to figure this out. So I mean, I think it explains a lot.
Self-imposed sort of requirement.
All right. So, studies suggest that the peak duration of spiritual and Kundalini awakenings is typically short, lasting from several minutes to several hours, with traces lingering for a longer period. I thought this was kind of weird. I think they must just be talking about like the peak experiences, because I think mine was 6-9 months. I mean, a lot of these people, there's a period that it goes on. Whether long or short, in peak duration, these intense psychological shifts in consciousness often lead to long-lasting and even permanent changes to the subject's sense of self and of the world around them, often from an experience of fragmentation of purpose and meaning to loving engagement with life. These experiences are therefore considered deeply healing. Some of the cognitive and behavioral shifts linked to these experiences include increased empathy, compassion, gratitude, openness, trust, altruism, curiosity, awareness, creativity, authenticity, integrity, a sense of higher purpose and meaning in life, a sense of virtuous mission or selfless service towards humanity, a sense of being reborn and liberated from past attitudes and beliefs, a sense of devotion to love-based values, and a rejection of religiousness and materialistic lifestyles. These deep shifts may lead to radical changes in religious and philosophical views, relationships, and career paths. And absolutely. And as you'll see, these are the same things that are happening in people's psychedelic experiences and near-death experiences. An interesting statistic from Eben Alexander's book, I read The Mind of the Universe or something. I didn't read his original book is called Proof of Heaven. So yeah, he had this near-death experience, woke up and just couldn't accept the answers that skeptical physicians were telling him. And so he just had to deconstruct everything. And very similar, I really relate to his story. Like he had to figure out quantum physics and philosophy and like how this actually made sense, and reincarnation, and look into studies and past life memories and stuff. And a very, very good book. But Proof of Heaven is his first book. And then I read a later one, which is more sciencey. But he said that 80% of marriages do not survive a near-death experience, which I think speaks to just, and I think those are probably a similar thing with spiritual awakenings.
Yeah. Well, that term near-death experience, I hold a little looser in my mind now, because there's the near death of the physical body, but I think there can be the near death of the mind in some ways, or at least the ego, the consciousness. There can be like layers, the dimensions that we exist in besides just the physical can also near die or die entirely and be reborn. I think of that, like you just read, a sense of higher purpose, meaning life, a sense of being reborn. Of course, in the New Testament, Jesus says you must be born again, as he's speaking to the Pharisee Nicodemus, and he's like, dude, does that mean I enter into my mother again and come back out? He's like, I'm not talking about that. So that reborn kind of motif is really strong, even without it being a near-death experience. Something dies.
With near-death experience, though, I'm referring to, and there's pretty significant overlap between these experiences, where there's kind of these life reviews, and they see that it's all about, how they made other people feel, and reincarnation, and there's a lot of overlap. They're not all the same, and again, they're kind of filtered through the different lenses that people have, and depending on how much is still, I guess, how much their brain is still working and filtering. He had very, very little neocortical activity. And so he didn't remember anything about his real life. And so he had a very raw and profound experience. But yeah, his experience was interesting because a lot of the same things happening, very little sleep that he needed. He experienced a lot of synchronicities, feelings of energy. And I was reading, I was like, oh my gosh, like, yeah, his experience is very similar to my experience, even though mine wasn't a near-death experience. Interestingly enough, it's kind of a side note, but there was a study I read recently that was comparing near-death accounts to psychedelic experiences. They were using machine learning to analyze the trip reports, and ketamine was the psychedelic that most similarly matched a near-death experience.
Yeah, that is interesting. Experiences that can be considered deeply healing. Yeah, I also thought about a sense of virtuous mission or selfless service towards humanity. In the raw materials, the Law of One, the channeled work from the 80s, where they're kind of channeling this this being that's existing in a higher density, that's raw, that's kind of explaining how things work in terms that we can understand, I think. Anyway, in there, it breaks down to, like, once you've had the gnosis, or once you've had the experience of the oneness, then you can see your actions, or you can see your drive in life being toward service to self, that they shorten as STS, or service toward others, STO. And it kind of breaks down to a binary of reaching out, serving other people, devoting your life to that, or serving yourself, which isn't always a bad thing. And it's not put in that context necessarily of this is right and this is wrong. You can't really do all of one of those, or you can't only do one of those. It comes down to, I think. But yeah, that is a big part of I think what came out of my own experience for myself. Is recognizing, having a different angle on that. In the church, we're raised on the notion of service, and that it is of great value, and that there's blessings that follow and all of that. And certainly experienced it in that system. And then beyond that, I think that still is something that Mormonism doesn't have a monopoly on, that, the consciousness serving itself ultimately through us.
I mean, it's interesting. The bizarre paradoxes of my journey are, I felt the spirit so much stronger going in the opposite direction. Letting go of God, letting go of an atonement that like, I'm fallen and I need something from somebody else to heal me. Once I let go of these things, actually, like, at the most profound, quote unquote, spiritual experiences. And then the most Christ-like love I have found were people that were, not traditional Christians at all, and were people that could be some of the, like, considered the worst people in church because they're using psychedelics, or like, meditating is not a religious thing. So it's very interesting, these people that don't hold a traditional view of Christ. Really, I've never felt unconditional love that much, because in Christianity, you're taught to treat other people like they are yourself. Through these experiences and through spirituality, you know that other people are yourself, and treating somebody like they're yourself versus knowing somebody is part of you and is another reflection of you, are different.
Yeah, that gnosis, the difference between understanding that bee stings hurt and being stung by a bee, kind of the thing.
All right. So spiritual and Kundalini awakenings are associated with a wealth of sustained positive therapeutic outcomes, such as a decreased risk of committing suicide among suicidal individuals following their experience. And these experiences may lead to an increased interest in spiritual based lifestyles associated with improved positive identity, positive coping, problem solving, and integrity, which in turn have been linked to a decrease of psychopathological tendencies. In some cases, spiritual and Kundalini awakenings trigger challenging short or long term sensory affective cognitive or physical effects, such as are not limited to panic, disorganized thoughts and behaviors, persistent involuntary movements of the body, uncomfortable sensations of heat and burning in the body, digestive problems, and challenging extrasensory like experiences. Additionally, these experiences have been linked to better performance in psi tasks involving precognition. Distressing awakening experiences, also known as spiritual emergencies or crises, may arise as a direct consequence of the initial experience when an individual is left feeling overwhelmed, confused, or challenged by the drastic perceptual shifts that tend to emerge from these experiences. And by their potentially powerful energetic nature, spiritual emergencies may also occur during the integration period following an awakening experience, as the individual finds themselves stripped of all pre-existing beliefs and concepts of life without an appropriate framework through which to interpret their new gained insight, and often without an appropriate support system to which they can turn. Because of this, it is assumed that spiritual emergencies may more frequently occur in case of sudden or spontaneous awakening and outside of a religious or spiritual context. However blissful initially, the experience of deep psychological change catalyzed by spiritual or Kundalini awakenings may provoke distress leading to spiritual emergency, which psychiatrists are likely to diagnose as acute psychotic experience indicative of psychopathology. I think this is, really important. So there is something called the spiritual emergency, and there are unpleasant parts of this because this brings up a lot of stuff that have been holding you back, and you have to go through. It's like having a foreign body in your hand, and for years you've been putting triple antibiotic ointment on it and getting injections of anesthetic, putting a Band-Aid over it, and you don't feel the pain. And then at some point, it just doesn't work anymore, and you have to go digging for something that's been there for a long time. And I really liked what Radio Free Mormon had said in one of his episodes. Somebody called in and they're thanking him for his content, and I think it was him and Bill Reel. And the person was talking about how it basically said, I think he said that they kind of turned his life upside down, but he's through it now and he's on the other side. And they were talking about, and I hadn't thought of it this way, is that often when people leave the church, it is chaos and it's painful, and your life crumbles, and your marriage may end, and it is not comfortable. And that initial period is often viewed by members as that's what happens when you go away from the spirit. And some people get stuck in that state. But more and more, a lot of them, and more are getting through it, and they're so much happier than they were before. And that's not as apparent to people because it's kind of after the fact and people have kind of moved on.
Yeah.
And you're also, I know I was as a member, looking for, how do I quiet the feeling inside, the gnawing feeling that this person just left, and maybe I will never have the courage to do that because deep down at some part of myself, I know that I struggle with these doubts and it's getting lonelier here. And
Yeah.
so if you can pin it on them sinning or something else, it feels so much more comfortable. And so
Mm-hmm.
I think that leads into this, is that there's and this is the dark night of the soul that, Eckhart Tolle talks about. You have incredible highs, and it also means you have some very deep lows, and there is a aspect of that where that's
Yeah.
when you have the highest highs, is when you experience the deepest pain. And and that's how a tree grows, is that it needs deep roots to anchor it. And so I think that
Yeah.
there's the only way past is through.
Yeah. And I think like that correspondence idea, like a sine wave, as high as it can get, it can also get low, that much to that depth on the other side. And you mentioned earlier, having the guilt or shame, anger, hatred, these are lower vibratory, lower energy states that bring us down. And I had a thought actually earlier this week. I didn't expect to share it in the podcast, but I feel like it makes sense, which was, I was reading and thinking about the New Testament story of Peter leaving the boat, going out to see Jesus, who was on the water. And it's actually really, I'm finding a lot of value in revisiting the New Testament stories and thinking about them from this framework. And so this idea of, I'm leaving the boat, I'm on the water, and maybe there's a few successful steps, like, oh my goodness, I'm experiencing beauty like I never have before. I'm seeing things that I've never seen, or at least I have a perspective on life that I've never seen before. I can walk through a grocery store and feel a deep, deep empathy for everyone around me, or a love maybe that I've never felt before. It's those moments of stepping on the water and like approaching this, going toward this ideal of the self, this actualization of the self that's calling to you, that's outside of where it was comfortable before. The boat made sense, standing on the water doesn't. But then there's that moment where he looks down and recognizes, oh, I'm on water.
Mm-hmm.
Immediately sinks. And I think many people can get caught in that. And it strikes toward, we're hitting very much at, I think, the center ultimately of what this podcast, what I have interest in doing this podcast with you, Gabe, is setting up an alternative narrative besides just staying in that cycle of the anger, the fear, the shame, the guilt, and feeling triggered by it, and feeling constantly that it took something from you that you'll never get back. And staying in that cycle, which I see there's a wide community online of people that stay in there. And maybe there's some healing aspects to participating in that for a minute, but at some point this hand reaches down from a different dimension through the water, you grab back. Ultimately, I see it now as myself, the actualization of a higher self, the higher mode of being, and staying out of that dark night. It's almost like you can wait around to get through it, but you could also kind of grasp back at what's already pulling you out. So, some imagery there, but revisiting that story was interesting this week, and how it ties into what we're just talking about.
Yeah, that does relate, I think, to what when I had these shifts, the way I conceptualized it was from an evolutionary perspective. I had these shifts of thinking of like different gears of my consciousness was, I've got this is an oversimplification, but, I've got this limbic system, this amygdala, that I needed it. And I needed to go through a period. We evolutionarily need to go through a period where we're just like right or wrong, safe or unsafe, fight, flight, or I can rest, digest. But then we continue to evolve, and we've got this higher state of consciousness, this prefrontal cortex, and but there's an either or aspect, to some degree, where one's active or the other is active. And the problem is the amygdala, I think, has got like a 40 million year head start, that it's been around that much longer. And so we're trying to reach that other rung. Interestingly enough, in lucid dreaming, they have put people in MRIs, and when they gain lucidity, they see the amygdala quiet down, and I think the prefrontal cortex, basically, the higher brain functions, come more alive, because you realize, like, oh, this is a dream, and I have some power. Like, I can control things, and that's, I think, a parallel for waking up, is realizing, like, oh, there's a bigger picture. I have some control here. Things will work out. And once it's kind of bootstrapping the system. Once you realize that, you're able to operate from a place in which you're more likely to get the outcomes that are safer and more ideal and keep you out of the amygdala. So it is, you do have to jumpstart it a bit.
Yeah, the awareness of it, and then recognizing that emotion is part of that whole system. And then that actually brings me back to the snake that's coiled at the base, the chakra energies at the bottom, let's say in the seat, right? And it moves up the spine. That's like that evolutionary ladder of coming in from the darkness of the bottom of the ocean or wherever else, that consciousness started. Or obviously consciousness sits below all of that too, but yeah, I like that.
All right, onward here. Parallels have been drawn between spiritual and Kundalini awakenings and psychopathologies such as bipolar disorder and schizophrenia, both by psychiatrists and transpersonal psychologists, though attempts have been made to separate both sets of experiences. Recent studies observing the differences and similarities between spiritual emergency, using the spiritual emergency scale, and psychosis have found spiritual emergency to diverge significantly from psychosis in alogia, which I think is the inability to speak, and in depression, anxiety, and stress. Thus, while overlaps are considerable, spiritual and Kundalini awakenings, including spiritual emergencies, are generally understood to not be indicative of psychopathology, even if they may be psychologically challenging at times. A multicultural approach to understanding spiritual experiences and their effects culminated in addition of the religious or spiritual problem diagnostic category in the 4th edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. While spiritual and Kundalini awakenings are no longer considered psychopathological by default, the accurate diagnosis of experiences falling under the religious or spiritual problem category remains challenging, partly because still too little is known about spiritual experiences and how these interact, interlink, or overlap with psychopathology, and partly due to a lack of spiritually informed clinicians who have a bias towards the pathologization of extreme anomalous experiences. As a result, the conventional psychiatric model is still overwhelmingly more likely to interpret potentially healing spiritual experiences as nothing more than mere psychopathology. This lack of understanding on behalf of clinicians remains problematic both for patients undergoing psychotic states with mystical features, which may be indicative of psychopathology, and patients undergoing non-pathological, though potentially distressing spiritual or Kundalini awakenings, which may be indicative of spiritual emergency. Inappropriate treatment of either group may result in harm and may trigger negative symptoms in positively perceived awakening experiences or intensify the negative symptoms of spiritual emergency. Either circumstance is likely to leave the individual in a state of trauma. This reminds me of a TED Talk that I think is titled Psychosis or Spiritual Awakening. And it's just a story of a guy who I think was hearing voices and initially was treated to try to eliminate the voices, medicated, whatnot, but did not have good quality of life, and eventually stopped the medication and worked to integrate it elsewhere. And the presenter was talking about how, in other societies, these people go to shamans who help them interpret and integrate and come to terms in peace and be curious about this, or develop it into like a spiritual gift that like the shaman has, which I think would be more aligned with people that hear voices to some degree. Again, there's a whole wide range. And so there's a shift taking place in mental health around people that hear voices, which isn't necessarily part of the traditional definition of spiritual awakening or Kundalini awakening, but falls under this, where instead of, I guess in the 1980s, the guy that founded this hearing voices movement, a patient questioned why it was okay for the psychiatrist or psychologist to believe in a God that he could not hear or see, but it was not okay for her to believe in voices that she could hear. And so that the person that formed this group later compared the treatment to eliminate voices as similar to conversion therapy, which is interesting. But this hearing voices movement is more about integrating and eliminating the stress and the anxiety, and recognizing that these voices, depending on if you want to view it from like a metaphysical or just like a materialistic perspective, even from a materialistic perspective, it's coming from somewhere. It's coming from somewhere in the subconscious, and it's a reflection of some internal process that getting curious about and seeing how it links up with stress factors, trauma in their life, might be more helpful than trying to eliminate and suppress. And but I'm not too familiar with it. But yeah, it's just a different way of viewing these things. But there is some overlap between psychopathology and spiritual awakening in terms of how they present. And I think there's a spectrum, and a lot of it depends on who is going through it and how they're resourced, and then so much is dependent on like how they're supported. I mean, for me, again, I would have really, really struggled, difficult enough time as it was, but really struggled had I not had an old roommate that knew something about Kundalini Awakenings. He didn't know much. He just knew that it was a thing. And what I was explaining seemed to line up. And so I looked it up. And again, if he wasn't there, if I wouldn't have made the connection with a person who had gone through a similar thing and was a counselor, or working on her degree. Yeah, so many steps along the way that were really crucial and influential to me that many people don't have. So
yeah, these spiritual experiences, or one of these, it says here, individuals experiencing auras of a spiritual nature such as autoscopy, I think, autoscopy maybe, the experience of seeing oneself in the form of one's double or through the lens of an out-of-body experience. I think a lot of people, there's a growing community online of people trying to astral project and kind of bring on some sort of out-of-body experience, but otherwise people have had them maybe through some kind of trigger like this or something else. And I've a really someone who's really close to me has had an out-of-body experience, and it was described as terrifying. And it makes me think of like people that report psychedelic trips where, they call it a bad trip if it just gets on the terrifying side, or otherwise it can be wholesome or productive or thought of as really good. And you mentioned that that it can be both throughout while you're having this Kundalini awakening. Like it's not all pleasant, I think you said. And I think that like Jung's idea of integrating the past with the present self and finding a way to kind of make that reframe the narrative of what has happened to you and seeing it in different perspectives can be really healthy. And for me, being reframing like the role of Mormonism in my life, and then leaving it, not harboring the feeling of anger or that I've missed out on anything, or that I have all this regret for years of a life wasted, because I don't feel like there's any of that, that it is that in some ways I wouldn't have it any other way. That in some ways I'm very, very grateful for the perspective of being able to see I can still put on that believer hat in some ways to analyze a situation or to think about something, and then I can see it from a different perspective too. It's almost like a superpower, how I would describe the benefit of it. Not something that maybe a believing person might be shocked to hear. And I certainly would at other times in my life would have been shocked to hear myself say, like, the real benefit of having both perspectives, of having experience in both perspectives. Like, I'm middle-aged, let's say I'm lucky enough to live another 30 plus years on the earth. And if I had 35 years in that system that was at the time a line upon line, a precept upon precept for me, then breaking through that barrier, or there's a lot of ways to describe it, and I think some are more productive than others, but just becoming entering into this new phase of life from another perspective, I think just in and of itself can be like, you can view it as positive, which can help, at least it's helped me stay in that stay away from the suffering that's brought on just from my perception, like the suffering that's brought on just because of the way I'm framing something, which I still do, of course, but yeah,
it's the same way, looking back on marriage, religion, really. And I think one of the profound realizations in the idea, the knowledge that you are everything. You, in some sense, you're you, but you're also the universe. There is nothing outside of the oneness that you are, is that everything, there's no inherent meaning to things. Everything is meaningless. I mean, this is that everything everywhere all at once. Nihilism is that, like, it's scary at first when you start to realize, like, everything's meaningless. But then if you break through to that, and you realize, it's meaningless because there's no other place, other thing, other person, other God to tell me what this means. And you realize that you, the universe, all meaning comes from within, and you actually have ultimate control over all meaning, and you can transmute, alchemize, and that's what you have power over, is to be able to look back and ascribe meaning. And some people are critical of that, is like, oh, you're just meaning making. That's all we do. And if you can make meaning that's helpful and lets you live a joyful life, I mean, why don't you make meaning that makes you happy and is internally consistent and helps other people? So you can't just make any meaning and just make up whatever you want. But if you have a myth, everything's a myth. Everything's symbols, constructs. And so if you can come up with a really good myth that explains everything and is beautiful and joyful and blissful, then, like, that's the point.
And I think we're so lucky to live in an age and a time where we have access to knowledge, because we're talking about ideas here, a lot of them centered in ancient Eastern philosophies, and yet we're both from kind of a more Western culture, of course. But we have almost an obligation, or an opportunity rather, to integrate those, the East and the West, the past it doesn't have to be viewed any longer as a binary of the West and the East. We can take the meaning from the stories, the allegories, the myth, from all of it, and we're talking about integrating it into a whole, being circumscribed into one whole, as it were. And gosh, I think of it like entropy, where the effort to make the meaning is what makes the beautiful outcome. So in other words, like entropy is going to get to oneness just through diffusion. Mm-hmm. Let's say without any effort, entropy leads to everything being just all kind of one thing, because it eventually cools everything down to a temperature where there's nothing. Things exist in relativity to each other with poles and opposites. And reality seems to be just kind of the conundrum of all of that polarity. And when I put no effort into it, the entropy, the diffusion goes toward the nihilism, the void being one thing that is of no meaning or value. But the energy I put into it, trying to stay out of those lower level vibratory fields and is trying to approach it as I'm not going to say this myth is right and that myth is wrong. I'm going to say, let me look at these two myths and let me find the common ground or the themes that emerge out of them, and let me connect it with everything else that I'm finding in these other places. And then that work of it, that art of it, is what resists the entropy and creates the tapestry, I would say, that I'm trying to like formulate in my mind and in my heart and in my soul of what the meaning of life is. If I don't do anything, it's all just nihilism, and entropy just brings it all into one anyway. Might as well make it a beautiful tapestry of meaning and purpose, because ultimately I do have this moral code that is the combination of like all of these myths coming up through time, right? Like there are people who would argue that without Mormonism, or let's say without Christianity, or leaving a faith-based religion, means that you cannot have a moral code. Like by definition, there's an argument that you can't have a moral code without it. But I find that the moral code emerges out of the polarity of religion and non-religion, and out of spirituality and non-spirituality, and it exists in those things coalescing, rather than saying I need Christianity to have a moral code. Christianity has never existed in a vacuum, and the moral code of the society that doesn't have Christianity had an impact on those that did, and vice versa. So it's like a leapfrog. It's like there are times when religion seems to bring humanity farther along because it has the further, maybe the advantage in a moral code space, and there are times when a non-religious aspect of ourselves has the higher ground in a moral code and pulls religion along behind it until it can leapfrog it, kind of a thing.
I listened to the part of the debate between Bill Reel and Jacob Hansen, and that there's a place that apologists or religious people try to needle atheists on, and I think it's silly because it's operating within space-time, and evolution is a product of physical matter and space-time. And going to Donald Hoffman, this kind of get in the weeds, but if everything's actually just an icon of a different, deeper, fundamental reality and truth that is extended beyond space-time, and this is just and so these mystical experiences are actually, they're the unraveling of the kind of the origami structure that gets folded into space-time, and you're actually accessing these unraveled aspects of reality in these altered states of consciousness. To me, the idealism and the idea that the universe is mental, it is a consciousness, it's a brain, And just like when you sleep, you subdivide part of your processing power into being little Eldon, and then you've got these other cast of characters in the background which you think are separate than you. But then when you gain lucidity, you realize that you're everything, you can control it. Or when you practice dream yoga, meditate in your dream, apparently you can wrap up that all into a harmonious consciousness and get samadhi or whatever easier in dreaming. If that same thing is happening on this level, which is kind of the idea of Tibetan Buddhism, if we are a consciousness that is kind of dissociated from itself and we're little alter egos of this universal consciousness, I think the myths that what we're going for is a version of explanation of reality, a myth of reality that's the most parsimonious and simple. And that's why everything goes down to one, because one, it makes sense. And two, if it goes down to two things, like why are there two things? Like, why not just one? You have to have some explanation for why you need matter and then consciousness arising from matter. If you can solve the problem with just consciousness and then matter comes from consciousness, like it's do it simpler if it works that way. And so if the universe is mental, I mean, it's instead of kind of this complicated thing of morality of like, well, for the better of humanity, but then what about animals and the earth? Is like, this is all a consciousness. We're like going through cosmic therapy and we're doing parts work, and really morality is just harmony, the harmonious consciousness.
Yeah, I had a thought at one point during kind of some of those, I would say those weeks or months that equate to the awakening, is that I was like, there's really no disorder. Disorder is just a perception, because these fundamental particles, or even what sits beneath these fundamental particles, are just doing exactly what they're supposed to be doing at all times. It just, when we're zoomed out to the level where we're trying to interact with the world, then we call it disorder, we label it disorder, but it doesn't actually appear to be disorder at some scale. And so morality, if we're part of the one consciousness, it's like if you ever ran from the thing in your dream that was terrifying you, it was you. You run from someone in your dream that's chasing you to do you harm. It's actually you in the dream, because it's all you in the dream.
And the true way that you heal in therapy is, I think parts work is a great example, is that you don't suppress the part of you that has anger towards this person, or that you connect with that part, you understand it, you hold it, you say, I understand why you're angry because of this experience that you had, and you understand, you empathize it, you integrate it in, and that's, I think, where religion gets it so wrong, is that without that oneness, there's always another place, a hell, a Satan to blame, hell to cast people off to. And you see plenty of people trying to keep their life together by repressing, I'm a bad person if I just get rid of this part of myself. I can't believe I did this. And then it comes out in sickness, it comes out in projection towards other people, it comes out in anxiety, depression. And so, I think morality is actually pretty simple. It can get a little complicated. Like, in this situation, what is the moral thing to do? Ultimately, it's the thing that has the most positive benefit for everything. And that looks different from situation to situation. But the key is actually recognizing that there is no separateness. And once everything can recognize that, then you have this harmony, and it's a lot easier to, wealth inequality, all these things go away. All right. Yeah. So this next part is interesting. We won't spend too much time on it, but it starts to relate. It says this to neurobiology. So spiritual experiences have been linked to temporal lobe epilepsy. And then with individuals, like you said, experiencing auras of a spiritual nature, such as autoscopy, the experience of seeing oneself in the form of one's double, or through the lens of an out-of-body experience, clairvoyance and telepathy, visual and auditory hallucinations of a religious or archetypal symbolic nature, and the repetition of religious phrases during seizures and after seizures. Some of the common features of spiritual and Kundalini awakenings have also been reported by temporal lobe epilepsy experiencers, including strong sensations of a cosmic, divine, or godlike presence or energy, and a sense of being connected with the infinite or oneness. I have a friend who has something that, she's gone through some trauma, and she's very kind of disconnected with her body. She's been, all her life she was worried about like separating from her body because she can dissociate and get into these states very easily. But lately, the last couple of years, she's been able to explore it a bit more and have some really positive, blissful nirvana experiences with it. But it's still hard for her to control. But weirdly enough, she had an experience last year where she pulled her partner's consciousness into the astral plane with her, like they were not on anything, just lying on a blanket at a festival. And then all of a sudden they weren't in time and space, but they were both existing there and had this experience, and then came back to time and space reality. And we're like, oh my gosh, like, did you just experience that? And yeah, so this, it's interesting. And that kind of borders on like a medical thing. She's been seeing different people because it's not always healthy. It's hard for her to control, but yeah, there's weird overlap.
Sounds terrifying.
Yeah, weird. It's all a spectrum. Some of these things are medical, some of them are more medical, some of them more spiritual. Personality trait absorption measures the depth to which one's attentional and experiential involvement occurs in relation to internal or external stimuli without effort or control, and has been used to measure proclivity for altered states of consciousness. It has been found to be a good predictor of altered states produced by psychedelic substances. So this is another trait that personality trait absorption can indicate people that have more profound psychedelic experiences. Says it's also a good predictor of mystical or quasi-mystical experiences produced endogenously in contexts like the anechoic darkroom in the whole body perceptual deprivation tank. I think that's like a float tank maybe. And during guided shamanic journey visualization, traditionally the trait has been associated with fantasy proneness, hypnotizability, imagery, ability, openness to experiences, alterations in body image, time-space perception, and meaning, higher emotional sensitivity and emotional brain processing, stronger empathy, stronger flow states, intellectual curiosity, more pronounced creativity and engagement in the arts, positive emotional responses to music, more pronounced experiences of synesthesia, and an attachment to nature and other forms of life. Relative to the general population, the trait of absorption has also been associated with experience of dissociation and hallucinations and paranormal beliefs or experiences, such as hearing voices or feeling spiritual presences and feelings of self-transcendence. Deeper states of absorption can be cultivated through ritual, including communal repetitive behaviors such as chanting or drumming, meditation, prayer, and the disruption of homeostatic balance, including through the ingestion of certain psychotropic substances. This is interesting because I do not have good personality trait absorption. I struggle with guided meditations. I struggle with getting out of like space-time. My mom is very good at it. She was telling me about some guided meditation somebody was leading her through recently. And she's like, oh yeah, I went into this space and I was like floating in the ocean and this and that. And I really struggle with that. I've tried to do like past life regression stuff on YouTube. I struggle with it. And so that's all the more interesting that I had a Kundalini awakening when I'm definitely not, this is not my strong point. I even got on stage to be hypnotized when I was in college too. And I remember like doing it because I didn't want to look stupid, but I know that's different than actual hypnotization, but not as suggestible.
Yeah, it makes me think of these are a lot of ideas or fantasy proneness, hypnotizability, a lot of things that might just turn some people off right away when hearing them, or to say that they're maybe not susceptible to those things. But another way to frame it is what I really like. I think I mentioned on another podcast the growth mindset. And I need to be able to quote the doctor who wrote the book, but the book is about how there's basically two ways as we grow that we develop the mindset with which we approach challenges. One is a fixed mindset, and that's the I can't do this. One is the growth mindset, which means I can't do this yet, or I need to practice this more to be able to do it, or I need to approach this differently to be able to solve it. And that openness to experiences, the openness to a different language or a different culture or a different kind of framework to describe reality, I think is fundamental in having, maybe not even triggering these things, but thinking about them or reframing them positively. I think having that open mind, that we don't have a way to fully explain everything. Even the language we're trying here is just a model and an approach of it. It's like pi. We'll only get more and more digits, but we'll never get the whole thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The fantasy proneness dissociation makes me think of Joseph Smith. I mean, because he was supposedly telling stories about the Nephites and the Lamanites to his family before he got the plates, and so we definitely had the ability to get into those states, I think.
Well, and I think there is research around the people who may be more prone to conspiracy kind of ideas that circulate, like that. I don't know. They could be more prone to just. I know I love a good fantasy, and yeah, I think there's something there.
Yeah. Studies investigating the phenomenology of mystical experiences produced by certain drugs, such as strong psychedelic compounds, psilocybin and DMT, ayahuasca, their therapeutic potential and long-term impacts on well-being suggest close similarities with spontaneously occurring spiritual and Kundalini awakenings. However, little research has been conducted on the latter. Furthermore, comparisons between the phenomenological distributions of various measured drug and non-drug induced altered states of consciousness have revealed strong phenomenological similarities between both sets of altered states of consciousness, as well as similar predictors of the experiences, including temporal lobe lability and trait absorption, suggesting the potential for some of these measures to be applied to study spiritual and Kundalini awakenings. And then on to, so that was all the introduction. We'll go quicker through. That was the most interesting, dense part of this. So the actual study, participants were recruited to take part in the survey through social media. The experience was described as follows: quote, "Have you ever had a strong experience of a profound spiritual nature in which you suddenly and non-intentionally felt in contact or communion with something that is considered to be an ultimate reality, God or the divine? Have you ever felt your ego suddenly transcended beyond an ordinary personal identity in space and time, and that you became one with the universe?" End quote. All participants were aged over 18 and must have experienced a spontaneous spiritual awakening or spontaneous Kundalini awakening at least once in their lives. Participants who had experienced it under the influence of psychoactive drugs were excluded. So I think that's really important, is the idea that, they're excluding psychedelics. And I think that's what I really value in my experience, is that I didn't have anywhere to run from this or any way to dismiss it, because I hadn't taken anything, I hadn't done anything, was not meditating at the time, and just had such a profound, beautiful experiences that I had to figure out how to integrate it. And this really strikes, emphasizes the importance, I think, of focusing on altered states of consciousness as a destination, irregardless of the mode of transportation. And I think, first of all, I think there's these kind of this domain of altered states of consciousness where you've got at least three axes. One is like intensity. You can have really strong ones or fairly mild ones. Then there's, I think, a polarity of like really positive or negative, towards the mystical experience versus a, psychopathology, bipolar, schizophrenia. And then I think there's also like a flavor too. And so that kind of is the MDMA versus psilocybin, or like a oneness or love or transcendence, so there's different, so it's kind of this whole big map, and there's a spectrum, and we are starting to map this more. And I read a recent study talking about how like depression is probably best viewed as a state of consciousness that you are in, that you can get in. And they're kind of like all different sunglasses that you're wearing. Within that whole map of different states, I think there are some that are pretty important. And one is like this kind of mystical, classical mystical experience, which is this ineffability and oneness and bliss and transcending space and time. So just kind of focusing on that, this idea, people really focus on psychedelics because it's the most reproducible way, easiest way. But then I think then you miss the point to some, or you run the risk of missing the point. And because it's also the same experience that religious mystics have been doing, sometimes just through like prayer or meditation or fasting. And then there's these spontaneous spiritual awakenings, Kundalini awakenings, that are also getting there too. And it's as though you've got a destination like New York City, and everybody's pretty much flying there on the plane. And it's so common that that's how they're getting there, that people are confusing the plane ride and the city. And they're like, I love flying on a plane because then you get to see the Empire State Building, you get to see Central Park, and like, I can't wait to the next time to fly on a plane. But then you find some other people that like, oh, I've seen Empire State Building and Central Park. I did not fly in a plane though. I took a metro, or in this case, like a metro stopped, a bus stopped, somebody dragged me inside, and like, I didn't really have a choice. Or there's other people that, oh, I did it. Yeah, I hitchhiked there. And sometimes people are like, oh no, you must have been in a different place, because like I definitely was on a plane. But you realize like, no, we saw the same place. We were at the same city. And that is something that's separate and independent from the mode of travel. And the more you realize that, the easier it is to understand this and to tease out what consciousness is and what religion is, what the meaning of life is, because it's very offensive to many religious people, especially Mormons, that you're like, oh yeah, Joseph Smith was doing mushrooms or whatever, because it's like, no, like doing drugs. But if you really like walk through it methodically, and like, there's a state of consciousness, higher state of consciousness that you can get to. And that seems to line up with things that happened in Joseph Smith's life and throughout history, and actually perfectly maps onto what Christ had happened in the Garden of Gethsemane, particularly through like a Mormon lens of like, oh yeah, he experienced all of time, all suffering, plants or animals and humans, all death. And I was like, oh yeah, that's exactly the description of a mystical experience. But you just think that he's the only one that experienced it, and there's some special power of that, because it's such an unfamiliar experience to many people, that you have to, you're a fallen man. So you can, if you haven't experienced it yourself, you can really get lost. So yeah, I think really not focusing so much and needing it to be psychedelics, and just describing both religion in general and saying, oh yeah, like religion is created by these mystical experiences. Probably psychedelics played a big role in that. Mormonism altered states of consciousness, there's some instances that psychedelics really seem to have played a role because groups are experiencing this together. But if you're dead set on it needing to be a certain modality, you start having to wrest the evidence and needing things to be a certain way. I think you should be open to the fact that some people have a tendency to experience these more often than not, because of certain traits they have, neurobiology they have, childhood traumas and experience they've gone through. And then it becomes so much easier to fit things together.
And maybe often emerging at midlife, maybe there's some correlation there too, because I think so often in midlife, we term the phrase midlife crisis, and there's a Jungian idea that it's not so much crisis as like just a bridge into another part of it. And so for me, I don't think it's a coincidence that some of this was, coincided with time in where I am in kind of the story of a life and loss leading up to it. As we mentioned earlier I think in this summary, even it talked about people can find these through, yoga poses or chanting or other. This is why sometimes I think religions grab onto those practices is people have been to places after going down that path, holding this rosary and saying this prayer multiple times in a row. There's something to that someone somewhere might have gone to a place and then come back with something. And so that's,
Yeah, if only people could realize you don't have to pay millions of dollars to build the temple to meditate and have peace. I mean, some people love the temple and have really peaceful, and I liked baptisms. I didn't really like the endowment, but it's really peaceful. But there's a good aspect of that. That's just meditation, being still, and
the sacredness can be everywhere, because it's what you bring into that room in the temple that's considered the most sacred there is what you get out of it. And I think you can bring that to a lot of other kinds of places too and get something very similar out of it.
Yeah. So they went over, a couple different scales they use. So there's a scale for non-dual embodiment, thematic inventory. There's a Kundalini Awakening scale, 30-item mystical experience questionnaire, a absorption scale, 11-dimensional alternate states of consciousness rating scale. So it's, again, really cool to see something so weird tackled so scientifically. So the results of all the participants, 60% chose to recall their most powerful spontaneous spiritual awakening, and 40% chose to recall their most powerful spontaneous Kundalini awakening. The age of the onset of these experiences ranged from 10 years or less to 67 years. Of all the participants, 21% responded that the peak of their experience lasted minutes, 10% hours, 8% days, 9% weeks, 14% months, 8% years, and 29% reported that the peak of their experience was still ongoing. Responding to the multiple choice question, considering your most powerful SSA or SKA, do you think there were any significant factors that led you to have this experience? 52% reported psychological turmoil or trauma, stress, depression, loss, bereavement, combat, addiction. 47% meditation practice, 32% spiritual literature. They could select more than one, so that's why these are more than 100%. 22% contact with nature, 22% past use of psychedelics or entheogens, 18% yoga practice, 13% near-death experience, 12% breath work, Wim Hof, holotropic, pranayama, 11% sacred sexual intimacy, 10% fasting, 9% no discernible trigger, 9% physical injury, 9% lucid dreaming, 9% sleep deprivation, 8% athletic activity, and 40% other factors. Most regularly practiced activities before the onset was contact with nature, 68%, and most regularly practiced after was meditation, so 80% practicing afterwards.
I find that fascinating, the contact with nature. And for me, a lot of thought about the oneness seems to like arise out of seeing just nature do its thing. And my wife loves gardening. She works really hard in the garden to make something really beautiful there. And it's like just seeing the analogies in the garden to what else is going on. It's like there's a fractal at the garden level of life in so many ways. And to see it all is just doing its thing. And we're trying to influence it, but how much control we really have of the garden, we're constantly reminded that we don't have as much as we would like. But just letting it, like, we found that we've got some bunnies, and we found that they love the dandelions, and it's cool to have like a part of our garden where we want dandelions because we cut the leaves and we give them to the bunnies. And so it's like, cool, dandelions have this place now. It's like that part of our garden over there is for the bunny food, some dandelions. So yeah, it's all there.
Okay. This is an interesting table. It was reported regularly practice activities before and after the spiritual awakening or Kundalini awakening. And they had what percent practiced this activity before and what percent active after. These are kind of all spiritual-ish practices. And they had the difference, the percent change. And so the ones that changed the most, meditation, 25% more people. So before was 54% practiced it, and then after was 79% practiced meditation. Breath work also jumped 25% from 28 to 54. And sacred sexual intimacy jumped from 18% to 35%. So those are the biggest jumps. All of these practices increased, interestingly, except psychedelics and theogen use dropped from 30% before to 26%. So it dropped 4 percentage points. So that's super interesting that, like, after this experience, there was less use of psychedelics. Of all participants, 83.6% reported that practicing these activities following the onset of the most powerful SSA or SKA helped them manage the experience. 6.6% reported that they did not affect the management of their experience. 2.6% reported that they worsened their experience. And 6.6% reported that the question did not apply. I know for me, I did a lot of walking barefoot, grounding, just kind of helping me stay in this 3D world, because you're just caught up in this whole new world of things that you'd never considered before, and felt good.
Yeah, I think yoga has a lot of benefit beyond just the stretching component of it. And for me, it was like I did yoga even before I would say I had anything like this, but it was after that I started thinking about yoga in a different way. And almost like starting a day off with yoga puts me in a way better headspace. But also it's kind of a fractal. It's like the whole day, especially starting yoga sessions where I'm like in a sitting or lying down position and then ending there. It's like a little fractal of an entire day or an entire life. And just trying to hit the forms. And for me, they're my forms of my body. So there's an ideal of what my body's capable of doing. It doesn't have to be what somebody else's body can do, but it's what mine is capable of doing. And that, I think, extends into a lot of other ways that I can see, like approaching life after this kind of experience.
Yeah, I've done a little bit of yoga. I liked it when I did it. I have not done it as much as I would like to. But
There's always tomorrow, Gabe.
yeah.
Hopefully.
So this is interesting. So the characteristics of the SSA or SKA, the highest, so they had just a list of traits or characteristics of the experience, and people rated them, how much they applied or not. The highest scoring item was, quote, an interest in clearly seeing the reality or truth about myself, the world, and others, rather than in feeling a particular way, which is like, I mean, this makes the difference between, this is real intent, basically. You know, there are people that are in the church and they're like, I don't have allegiance to the church. I have allegiance to truth, and I'm going to find out whatever is truth. And right now I feel like it's the truth, but like wherever that takes me, I'm going. And then there are others, and this is me for a long time, is like, I'm going to find the answers that help support the answer that I already want to do, to stay with, because that's what makes it least problematic for my life and my marriage and my just, you know, you want to, yeah, there's a real intent. Are you willing to just accept whatever answer you get? The lowest scoring item was, quote, a sense of fear or anxiety that inhibits my action. So what's interesting is that like these periods, these awakenings were not characterized by fear and anxiety that inhibited the action, concern or discomfort about the past or the future, a sense that I was protecting or defending a self-image or concept I held about myself, sense that my actions in life were motivated by fear or mistrust, a desire to be understood by others. You know, it's just people just letting go of needing, of who they thought they were, who they were trying to pretend they were, and fear. And it's when life takes everything from you, then you finally are free to like, I don't have anything to lose, so I'm just going to connect with intuition.
Yeah. There's a Jungian analyst I really like, Dr. James Hollis, and he talks about the provisional life. You have like a childhood part of your life, and then you set up a provisional life, which is maybe for some of us do that, something like this, which is like you do what you're supposed to do because you were told that's what you're supposed to do, and it works for a long time. For some people, it works their whole life. For others, it only works for a little while, or until a certain series of events happens, or until something like this happens, and then you're kind of forced to recognize that it was only provisional for the time being. And then there's value in it, and then there's value in the childhood, the first part of life too, and integrating those into the third or into the remainder of what's left, and that life can do that in more than one time to you, that there's provisional on top of provisional, and then at the end of the day it's all you anyway. So, and I hope I didn't just completely butcher that. If James Hollis ever hears this and wants to reach out to me, I'd love to talk to the guy, frankly. But.
All right, the mental well-being implications. When participants were asked whether they felt their experience had been predominantly positive or negative in the short term, 91% responded that the experience was positive, and 9% responded that it was negative. However, when participants were asked whether they felt that their experience had been predominantly positive or negative in the long term, 98% responded that it was positive, with only 2% responding that it was negative, implying that SSAs and SKAs were more likely to be perceived as positive in the long term, even following negative short-term experiences, but that both short and long-term effects were predominantly positive. So then they start comparing them with some pretty cool graphs that show how they map. It's like a spiderweb graph with all the different spokes being different attributes. And they're comparing SSAs and SKAs to flotation, breath work, Gans field in a dark room, and according to experience of unity, spiritual experience, blissful state, insightfulness, disembodiment, impaired control and cognition, anxiety, complex imagery, elemental imagery, audiovisual synesthesia, change meaning, and the SSAs, SKAs were more profound than all of them, but there was a lot of overlap. Particularly striking were the similarities observed, but then they compared it with drug states. So other modalities and then drug states. Particularly striking were the similarities observed between the phenomenological distributions of SSAs, SKAs, and psilocybin and DMT. Although mean SSA, SKA subscale scores are higher than both psilocybin and DMT in changed meaning, unity experience, spiritual experience, blissful state, insightfulness, anxiety, and impaired cognition, higher than DMT in synesthesia and complex imagery, and higher than psilocybin in simple imagery. A lot of overlap. And actually more profound than psilocybin and DMT. DMT is the active ingredient in ayahuasca, so pretty fascinating. Strongest similarities were observed between SSAs, SKAs, and DMT complete mystical experiences, where SSAs, SKAs scored higher in spiritual experience, blissful state, insightfulness, impaired cognition, anxiety, synesthesia, complex imagery, and change meaning. And DMT complete mystical experiences scored higher in simple imagery, disembodiment, and unity experience. So in most aspects, they were more profound than DMT, complete mystical experiences. While it is important to consider that the reported SSA, SKAs relate to the participants' most powerful experience, results suggest that the phenomenon is closer in distribution and magnitude to altered states of consciousness produced by strong doses of potent psychedelic drugs, particularly those capable of inducing mystical experiences such as psilocybin and DMT, than to any other measured drug and non-drug induced altered states of consciousness. So again, I think that's pretty fascinating that these experiences are most similar to psilocybin and DMT.
And I think we mentioned in another episode that DMT can be trace DMT amounts have been found in the human brain at different times, right? Isn't it?
They hypothesized that they found it in rat pineal glands, but likely humans too. Next is the effects on well-being. The results from our study indicate an increase across all measured spiritual and holistic practices post-SSA, SKA experience, except for the use of psychedelics and entheogens. These activities, including contact with nature, mindfulness, yoga, and meditation, cultivate healthy internal, pro-environmental, and pro-social behaviors such as increased altruism, empathy, trust, confidence, optimism, reduced stress and depression, and better problem solving. These results, therefore, not only support the supposition that SSAs, SKAs mediate overall positive short and long-term effects on well-being, but also that they trigger shifts towards more positive ways of living. These results are consistent with existing studies. Mystical experiences, including spiritual awakenings, have been linked to promising improvements in both subjective and objective states of well-being, as is evidenced by the sustained improvements of treatment-resistant depression, significant reductions in anxiety, hopelessness, and fear of death in patients with life-threatening cancer, and treatment-resistant alcohol and tobacco addiction mediated by psilocybin-occasioned mystical experiences. Then it goes on to say that the study challenges the pathologization of spontaneous awakening experiences, addresses the importance for an immediate destigmatization of these experiences within psychiatry, and invites a more holistic, patient-centered approach to researching spiritual and transcendent experiences. And then in regards to relationship with other altered states of consciousness, the observed similarities between the score distributions of SSAs and SKAs and all measured non-drug altered states of consciousness suggest phenomenological similarities between the groups, supporting the postulation originally put forth by psychiatrist Ludwig that all altered states of consciousness are phenomenologically similar, whether induced or spontaneous. However, the considerable higher mean scores observed across all subscales in the SSA-SKA sample relative to all measured non-drug altered states of consciousness suggest that SSAs, SKAs are generally reported as subjectively more intense. So that goes along with what I was saying about, all states of consciousness are similar, regardless of the modality, altered states of consciousness. And then the score magnitude observed across all subscales in the SSA-SKA sample relative to those of all measured drug altered states of consciousness also suggest that the SSAs, SKAs are more powerful than all measured drug modalities, including powerful psychedelic drugs. Particularly striking were the observed similarities, both the magnitude and distribution, with drug-induced altered states of consciousnesses capable of triggering mystical experiences, specifically psilocybin and DMT. These results are interesting, not least because the profiles of the drugs such as psilocybin and DMT are similar to those of SSA and SKs in their spiritual outcomes and proposed therapeutic effects. So this also goes along with this idea. I mean, ketamine, psilocybin, LSD, these are neuroplastic and they have a physiological mechanism of action, but they're also showing that the mystical experiences can't be divorced from the benefit too. And there's some aspect of just experiencing this and this spirituality that develops that is causing benefit too. So it's kind of both physiological, but you also can't ignore that the actual experience is doing something to reframe things for people.
Yeah. It's all so fascinating. And I think people that are in Mormonism, I think there's a lot of people who right now are trying to reconcile where Mormonism fits in their life if they've been raised in it or been a part of it for a long time. And then they start to have cognitive dissonance or whatever you might term the idea that like not all of it fits together with everything else that I know or that I'm learning in the world. And being like susceptible to the voice or the voices that are out there that are getting louder and louder to say that you should think of it this way. You should have, you should you should have a sense of regret for what Mormonism took from you. You should focus on it as an entity that does damage. And I think this kind of experience, if it's coupled with that, has a lot of potential to kind of break, at least for me, it broke me into a whole new dimension, a whole nother way of addressing like the problem solving of life, or the way to address what comes up in life, the way to think about things, everyday things. It's almost like Mormonism winds itself around every relationship and every aspect of a life. If as I was in it for as long as I was, I saw that it did that. And when it became something that, when I saw it for that it wasn't what it says it was, that it had to be replaced or that it had to be kind of rooted out, that's a really painful process. And this kind of a thing was how I was able to reconstruct, I think, a little bit. It's not like you can bring this on, though. We're not saying you could just wake up one day and say, I'm going to have a Kundalini awakening. Because in some ways, it, like with your experience, Gabe, it kind of came for you, came knocking. And so, yeah.
Yeah, I think what we're trying to do is help you be aware of the GPS telling you to get into the right lane 2 miles before you have to, because otherwise you're going to be jerking across traffic and it's going to be harder than it needs to be, but more profound. Or you might miss the exit and then you got to loop back around ways to get there. Yeah. last thing that I had highlighted here was just the predictors summary about the predictors. Temporal lobe lability and trait absorption are considered two effective predictors for measuring the proclivity for altered states of consciousness experiences. These have been used together to measure intensity of the experiences produced by drugs such as cannabis and in non-drug induced contexts such as the anechoic darkroom chamber, flotation tank, and during holotropic breathwork. According to our results, temporal lobe lability and trait absorption positively correlate with SSA-SKA experience, implying that individuals scoring higher in temporal lobe lability and absorption are more likely to experience higher intensity SSAs and SKAs. So, yeah, overall fascinating. For me, it was really helpful to have this and helped me integrate and validate my experience, because it is something that you don't really, I mean, you may at first share with people, but then you realize, depending on the reactions you get from people, it just doesn't fit into their framework. And you can be invalidated or, at worst, pathologized. And so I think this work is so important. I actually was really moved when I was reading this yesterday, and just really, because without this, I don't think I'd feel comfortable sharing my experience with people. And so I wrote the author letter, just really grateful, because I mean, this type of awareness of these phenomenon can make the difference between somebody having a profoundly positive shift in their life and somebody else, and a very negative outcome. I see some of these people like Lori Vallow, Chad Daybell. I watched a video about all these Gnostic versions of like breakoffs of Mormonism. And I said in a previous episode about an elder from my mission that started a cult. And in all of these, like the common thread in all of those were they had these psychedelic experiences that maybe could have been more on the pathology, psychopathology, maybe schizophrenia. But not necessarily all of them. People have these experiences and then either they're so fragile and they need to be some prophet or something, they need to be an enlightened being, or they just don't know any better, and that's a better alternative than being crazy. And so I think in some of those cases, if there was more awareness, a friend, therapist, somebody who could help them reframe and integrate, there'd be a different outcome. So,
Yeah. Hopefully someone hearing this is exposed to new languages, new ideas, new words, new models that can make something like this, if they go through it, productive and valuable, instead of just being confusing, maybe.
Yeah.
Or at least, yeah.
And I think it just really validates the fact that endogenously people can have psychedelic mystical experiences, which requires consideration of all these fantastical things happening in the organization of the church to be most logically and easily explained through some type of this phenomenon. And I think it gives you a much better holistic picture, requires less hand waving, and can ultimately help not just deconstruct it, but contextualize, reconstruct, and process. And so feel free to get in touch with us, Mormons, Mystics, and Muons at gmail.com. I particularly like to hear if anybody had experiences that would fall into this, and just general feedback about the show. More people are listening, which is great. But yeah, I'd love to hear what people's thoughts are and whether it's helpful to them, or any specific topics or thoughts or additions they have to share with us. And then also, please share it with others, rate, give us a review. It'd certainly be helpful, motivate us on to keep making content and sharing.
See where it goes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, Gabe, and thanks for sending me this article and your insight on it. I appreciate it.
Yeah. All right. We'll see everybody next episode.